It is common for people to inherit things like cash, real estate, jewelry from their loved one. What about shares or stocks, if you like? What happens if I inherit shares? First of all, is it even legal to inherit shares in your country? Okay, how do one pass stock to their heir? What are the legal effects? And many more questions. I mean, at this point, I kind of think, or rather in order for you to have clicked on this video, you know what shares are. A share basically can be defined as a single unit of ownership in a company. But then the question is, can you inherit shares? What's the process? What do we need to know? So let's talk about that. Now, if you're new to this channel, welcome to Zerite Network. Kindly do subscribe and hit the notification bell to be notified each time we put out videos on things like business, legal aspects, development, and all that stuff, okay? So let's start by talking about whether or not we can inherit shares. What are inherited shares? So the name suggests these are shares that one obtains as a result of their owner, okay? The original owner of those shares passing on or passing away. So if someone dies, if I die, and then the next of kin gets my shares, then those are inherited shares. That is not to be confused with gifted shares, okay? Which is the transferring of shares from one person or entity to another person or entity. I mean, you can give somebody shares as a gift. That's a good idea, especially if it's the shares of a growing company. So in that case, you're alive and you've given them the shares. I mean, that makes for a good birthday gift for those people who always give other people socks and vests on their birthday. There's something you can think of. Why not give them shares, in a company? That's part of the gifts. I'm not saying you give them shares in your company. I'm just saying you bought shares in a given company and you think I'll give you like 200 shares, whatever. So anyway, if a loved one, parents, grandparents, spouses, passes away, the shares they own will pass on to the beneficiary. The beneficiary's name will become the new legal owner of the stock, and thus the stock becomes an inherited stock. Of course, the process of doing this will vary depending on your country. Okay, so each country will have their own rules, and the rules will pretty much talk about things like taxes and all that stuff. What is important? You need to understand those rules. You also need to understand the tax that is associated with the shares that you inherit. I mean, most of these things are going to be defined in the Companies Act. So you kind of just have to look at the equivalent, the Companies Act or equivalent of Companies Act in your country. Okay. And again, other than that, a company itself can have its own rules regarding inherited or rather transfer of shares from the deceased to their next of kin or the beneficiary. So that is something you also look at in the Articles of Association of that particular company. A company may only register a transfer of shares if a proper document of transfer, that is transfer of shares form, has been delivered to it, failure to which the said transfer is rendered void. So this is where a good lawyer or a good tax accountant comes in. I mean, to handle stuff like that. But then again, remember, the reason why you need to understand this is because you need to know what exactly you're paying your lawyer to do. But what exactly you're paying your accountant to do? Because sometimes they're going to charge you. I mean, ignorance is expensive is all I'm saying. Now, still, there are two things that you need to understand, okay? First of all, the shares that you're talking about could be held by an individual. It was one person. Or the shares could be held in common. So your parent or your whatever it is had those shares, but then they bought them with somebody else. And so they are held in common. The challenge for the most part with shares held in common is that when one party dies, then the other party who is surviving automatically kind of just owns those shares. So that's a problem. So the general rule tends to be something like, if a member dies, the company may recognize only the following person or persons as having any title to a share of the deceased member. Number one, if the deceased member was a joint holder of the share, the surviving holder or holders of the share. Basically, this is the principle of survivorship. So in this case, the surviving member, as you pointed out, is the one who's going to, be recognized as the company as the owner of those shares. Number two, if the deceased member was sole holder of the shares, the legal personal representative of the deceased member is then the one who's going to be recognized as the person who now owns those shares. So that is what is going to happen. But then again, remember, these rules, this sort of thing will just depend on the rules that govern your country. So you sort of need to understand how are things done in your country. So you need to understand that. Go look at the Companies Act. Okay? For the most part, that is going to explain issues to do with this. And remember, for the most part, the law of succession and the Companies Act may not really go hand in hand. While in things like the law of succession, you automatically assume that the deceased property are going to be inherited by the dependents, and then there is a question of provisions for dependents. But then the Companies Act may actually say that we only deal with the person whose name appears in the register of members. And so if A did put B as their next of kin in the register of member, then they may not really care what the law of succession says. So these are some of the things that you need to factor in. Anyway, yes, shares can be inherited and the process will vary depending on your country. So if there is any question, do let me know. Also, if you're in a position to kindly, support this channel on Patreon. I'm Moses, and I'll see you in the next video.